the hammer of the gods, and the giants feared it. But even the strongest god cannot survive his final battle. Welcome to Shadow Folklore. Today, Thor. There is a sound that echoes through the mountains of the north. It is not thunder, though it resembles thunder. It is not the crack of stones splitting under frost, though it carries that same finality. It is the sound of a hammer striking against the skull of a giant, and it rings across the 9 worlds like a bell tolling the end of chaos. In the pine forests of Scandinavia, where winter holds dominion for half the year, and the sun barely clears the horizon even in summer, the old halls still stand in memory. Longhouses with turf roofs and carved gables, smoke rising from the central hearth, the smell of roasting meat and fermented mead, and on the high seat, where the jarl or the gothy, the priest, chieftain, would sit to dispense justice and receive offerings, there would sometimes be carved into the wood a simple symbol, a hammer, short-handled and blunt, worn smooth by generations of hands that touched it for luck before a voyage or a battle or a birth. The wind from the North Sea carries salt and ice. It howls through the fjords and across the exposed bedrock of the shield, scraping away soil until only stone remains. In this landscape, where survival depended on strength, and the gods were not distant abstractions, but necessary allies, one god stood above all others in the affections of the common people, not the wise, and one, Odin Allfather, who hung himself on the world tree to gain knowledge of runes. Not the beautiful and doomed Balder whose death presaged the end of all things, but the red, bearded thunderer, the giant, killer, the protector of Midgard, the realm of humankind. His name was Thor, son of Odin and Jaffe, the earth herself. The people who worshipped Thor spoke Old Norse, a North Germanic language that evolved from the Proto-Norse of the migration period, and would eventually fragment into the modern Scandinavian languages: Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, Icelandic, and Faroese. They called themselves by many names: Sphere, Gfetar, Norfemen, Danir. But history remembers them collectively as the Vikings, though that term properly refers only to those who went Viking, raiding and trading across the seas. The majority were farmers, fishermen, craftspeople, and traders who never left their homeland, but who lived under the same cosmological sky, worshipped the same gods, and told the same stories around the winter fire. This was the Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 CE, though the religious traditions it expressed were far older, reaching back into the mists of the Germanic Iron Age and the Bronze Age before that. The geographical range of Norse culture stretched from the windswept coasts of Norway to the forests of Sweden, across the Danish peninsula and into the settlements of Iceland and Greenland, and through the diaspora communities that established themselves in the British Isles, Normandy, the Russes principalities, and even as far as Constantinople and the shores of North America. The Norse cosmos was not a single sphere, but a complex architecture of 9 worlds arranged around Yggdrasil, the world tree, a cosmic ash so vast that its roots and branches connected all of existence. At the top, in Asgard, dwelt the Facer, the gods of order and civilization. Below them, in Midgard, lived humans, surrounded by a great ocean in which coiled Jaffe-Mungandra, the world serpent. Beyond Midgard, in the frozen wastes of Jaffatenheimer, dwelt the Jaffatenar, the giants beings of chaos and primal force, older than the gods themselves. There were also the Vanir, gods of fertility and prosperity, who had once warred with the Facer and then made peace. There was Faelfheimr, realm of the Light Elves, and Svartfaelfheimr, home of the dwarves who lived beneath the earth and forged wonders in their subterranean halls. There was Hel, the realm of the dead, and Muspelheimer and Niflheimer, the realms of fire and ice from whose collision the cosmos had first emerged. This was not a universe of eternal stability. The Norse understood that all things, even gods, were subject to fate, to word, the web of causality that no one, not even Odin, could escape. The gods were not immortal by nature. They maintained their youth by eating the golden apples of the goddess Ifen. And they knew that one day, at Ragnarök, the doom of the gods, They would face their final battle and fall. The giants would break free from their bondage. The dead would rise. The world tree would tremble, and fire and flood would consume the 9 worlds. But until that day came, the gods had a duty to maintain order against chaos, to protect the realms of civilization against the encroaching wild, and to fight. Thor was the champion of that fight. Among the gods, he held a unique position. He was not the king. That was his father, Odin, the Allfather, god of wisdom, poetry, war, and death. Thor lacked his father's cunning and his hunger for esoteric knowledge. He was not a shaman or a sage, but what he possessed was straightforward, overwhelming strength, unshakable courage, and an absolute commitment to defending both gods and humans from the forces of chaos. In the hierarchy of divine power, Thor was the enforcer, the warrior, the one who did what needed to be done when words and wisdom failed and only force remained, while Odin was the god of kings, warriors, poets, and those who sought hidden knowledge, often at terrible cost. Thor was the god of farmers and sailors, of those who needed protection from storms, from enemies, from the incomprehensible dangers that lurked beyond the firelight. When a field needed blessing, or a child needed naming, or a ship needed safe passage, it was Thor's name that was invoked. His symbol, the hammer, was carved into boundary stones, worn as an amulet, raised over a bride at her wedding to ensure fertility and protection. This was not merely superstition. In the worldview of the pre-Christian North, the gods were active participants in the world. They were not remote creators who set the cosmos in motion and then withdrew. They walked among humans, in disguise or openly. They had needs and desires, strengths and weaknesses. They could be bargained with, angered, pleased. And Thor, more than any other god, was invested in the survival of Midgard, because Midgard was under constant threat from the giants, and Thor had dedicated himself to killing them. Thor was, in the most literal sense, larger than life. According to the Prose Edda, written by the Icelandic scholar and politician Snorri Sturluson in the early 13th century. After the conversion to Christianity, but drawing on centuries of oral tradition, Thor was the strongest of all beings, gods or mortals. He was a massive figure, broad-shouldered and thick-limbed, with a wild red beard and eyes that blazed with inner fire. When he was angry, sparks flew from his beard. When he traveled, the earth shook beneath his weight. He owned 3 great treasures, each forged by the master craftsman of the dwarves, the Svartfælfar who lived in the caverns beneath the mountains. The first was Mjölnir, the hammer, which we will return to in detail. The second was Jafngripur, iron gauntlets, without which he could not wield Mjölnir, for the hammer's handle grew so hot in use that even Thor's divine flesh could not bear it. The third was Mjölnir, a belt of strength, which when fastened doubled his already immense power. Thor's home was Fafeheimr, the realm of strength. And within it stood his hall, Bilskirnir, lightning crack, which Snorri describes as the largest building in existence, with 540 rooms. His wife was Sif, a goddess whose golden hair was famous, hair that Loki once cut off as a prank, forcing the trickster to commission dwarven smiths to forge new hair from actual gold, which grew like living strands. Thor and Sif had a daughter, Freyja, whose name means strength or power. Thor also had 2 sons by the giantess Jafnsaxa, Emfe, Wrath, and Magni, Might. These sons would survive Ragnarök and inherit Mjölnir after their father's death. But Thor's most important possession, the object that defined him and made him the terror of giant kind, was the hammer, Mjölnir. The name itself is disputed in its etymology, but derived from Old Norse words related to lightning, or to crushing, or to white. It was a divine instrument of annihilation. When thrown, it never missed its target. It struck with such force that mountains shattered and giant skulls burst like overripe fruit. And no matter how far it flew, it always returned to Thor's hand, like a trained hawk to its master's glove. The Prose Edda preserves the story of Mjölnir's creation in the tale known as the Treasures of the Gods. Loki, the trickster, son of giants, blood, brother to Odin and constant source of chaos within Asgard, had cut off the golden hair of Thor's wife, Sif. When Thor found out, he seized Loki and threatened to break every bone in his body. Loki, ever the talker, swore he could get the dwarves to make new hair for Sif, hair of real gold that would grow like living hair. Thor released him, and Loki descended into Svartfheimheimer. He first went to the sons of Ivaldi, master smiths among the dwarves, who agreed to forge the golden hair. While they were at it, they also crafted two other treasures: Skidbladnir, a ship that could be folded up and put in a pocket, but would always have a favorable wind, and Gungnir, a spear that never missed its mark. Pleased with himself, Loki then encountered two other dwarven brothers, Sindri also, called Eitri and Broker. Loki, unable to resist, wagered his own head that these two could not make three treasures as fine as those of the sons of Ivaldi. The brothers accepted the wager. Sindri placed pigskin in the forge and told his brother Broker to work the bellows without stopping, no matter what happened. He left the room, and immediately Loki transformed himself into a fly and bit Broker on the hand. Broker did not stop. Sindri returned and drew from the forge Gullinbursti, a boar with golden bristles that could run faster than any horse, and whose bristles shone to light the darkest night. Sindri placed gold in the forge for the second item, and again instructed Broker not to stop pumping the bellows. Loki, still a fly, bit Broker on the neck. Much harder. Blood ran down, but Broker kept working. Sindri returned and drew out Dropnir, a golden arm ring that every 9th night would drip 8 new rings of each. For the third item, it was perfect in weight and balance, unbreakable, and imbued with the power to smash through anything and always return to the hand of the wielder. But because Broker had faltered for that single moment, the handle was too short. It could not be wielded with 2 hands as a proper warhammer should be. It was a one-handed weapon, slightly ungainly, but still the most powerful object the dwarves had ever made. The brothers went to Asgard to claim their wager. The gods assembled to judge which treasures were greatest. Loki presented the golden hair, Skidbladnir, and Gungnir. Broker presented Gullinbursti, Drapnir, and the hammer, which he gave to Thor, saying it could smash anything, and when thrown, it would never miss, and it would always return. And most importantly, with it, Thor could strike down any giant that threatened the gods. The gods conferred. Gungnir was given to Odin. Skidbladnir went to Freyr. Sif received her golden hair. Odin took Dropnir for himself. Freyr received Gullinbursti, and Thor received the hammer. The gods declared the hammer the greatest of all the treasures, because the giants were the most dangerous enemies of the gods, and the hammer was the best weapon against them. Loki had lost the wager. Broker demanded his head. Loki argued that he had wagered his head, yes, but not his neck, and Broker could not take the head without cutting the neck, which was not part of the bargain. The gods, amused, agreed. So Broker settled for sewing Loki's lips shut with an awl and leather cord, silencing the trickster for a while. This story, preserved by Snorri, was likely already ancient by the time he recorded it. It appears in variant forms in other sources, including skaldic poetry from centuries earlier. What it reveals is essential to understanding Thor and MJ Fenrir. The hammer is not just a weapon. It is the product of divine cunning, Odin's gift of the challenge to Loki, the skill of the dwarves, the chaos introduced by Loki, and the determination of Broker, its flaw. The short handle is a permanent reminder that even the greatest works are marked by imperfection. And yet, despite that flaw, it is the most necessary object in the cosmos, because without it, the gods would fall to the giants, and chaos would consume creation. The hammer is not merely Thor's weapon. Thor used MJ Fenrir not only to kill giants but also to consecrate and to bless. In the poetic Edda, in the poem Farimskvia, the Lay of Thrym, which we will examine shortly, the hammer is used to sanctify a wedding. Archaeological evidence confirms that hammers, or representations of hammers, were used in ritual contexts, to bless births, to hallow marriages, to mark boundaries, to dedicate new buildings. The hammer was both destroyer and protector, both weapon and wand. In the skaldic tradition, court poetry composed by professional poets in honor of kings and gods, Thor is called by many kennings, poetic circumlocutions that reveal his nature. He is son of Odin and Jafei, husband of Sif, father of Fafir, slayer of Ragnarök, a giant he killed in single combat, enemy of the serpent, Jafei Mungandra, lord of Bilskirnir, and most frequently, wielder of Mjölnir. A hammer is inseparable from his identity. In the visual culture of the Viking Age, Thor is less frequent, perhaps because the Norse did not create the kind of monumental religious sculpture found in other cultures. There are no towering statues of Thor like the Colossi of Egypt or the great temple reliefs of Mesopotamia, but we do have smaller artifacts, amulets, carvings, and especially the ubiquitous Mjölnir pendants, small hammer-shaped talismans worn around the neck. Hundreds have been found across Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the Norse diaspora. They were made of iron, bronze, silver, and even gold. Some are simple and abstract, a T-shape with a loop for a cord. Others are elaborately decorated with interlace patterns and runic inscriptions. One of the most famous is the Mjölnir pendant from Bredsfätra, Finland, Sweden, dating to the 10th century CE, which bears a runic inscription that translates roughly to "May Thor hallow these runes." Another, from Erikstorp, also in Sweden, shows clear Christian influence in its decoration, an indication of the religious fluidity of the conversion period, when people wore symbols of both the old gods and the new. Thor's iconography evolved somewhat over time and across regions, but certain elements remained constant: the red beard, the hammer, the association with thunder and lightning, and the role as protector. In some later Icelandic sources, influenced by continental European chivalric literature, Thor is depicted with slightly more refined manners, almost knightly, but the core of his character, the blunt, powerful, straightforward warrior, God, remains unchanged. What is essential to understand is that Thor was not an abstract principle. He was not the thunder in the way a philosopher might speak of natural forces. He was the god who caused the thunder. When lightning struck, that was Thor throwing Mjölnir. When storms raged, that was Thor riding across the sky in his chariot, drawn by two goats, Tangrisnir and Tangjefastra, whose hooves beat the clouds into rumbling percussion. The goats themselves were magical. Thor could slaughter and eat them in the evening, and if their bones were not broken, he could touch them with Mjölnir in the morning, and they would be restored to life. This motif appears in the tale of Thor's journey to Fatgarfeia Loki, which we will turn to next. The myths of Thor are not allegories in the way later Christian scholars tried to interpret them. They are not moral fables in the way Aesop's tales are moral fables. They are narratives of divine action in a cosmos that operates according to its own logic. A logic in which gods, giants, dwarves, and humans are all enmeshed in the web of fate, and in which strength, cunning, honor, and survival are locked in constant negotiation. The story most beloved by the common people, and the one that best illustrates Thor's character, is Thrymskvifeia, the Lay of Thrym, preserved in the Poetic Edda, a collection of Old Norse poems compiled in Iceland in the 13th century, but drawing on oral traditions centuries older. Thor wakes one morning to find Mjölnir missing. This is not a minor inconvenience. Without the hammer, Asgard is defenseless, who have been kept at bay by the constant threat of Thor's wrath, and Mjölnir's annihilating power will sense the vulnerability, and Thor, in a rage, shakes the entire hall. He goes immediately to Loki and demands help. Loki borrows the falcon, feathered cloak of the goddess Freyja, a magical garment that allows the wearer to fly, and soars to Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. There, he meets Thrym, a giant chieftain who is sitting on a burial mound, braiding golden collars for his dogs and trimming the manes of his horses. Loki asks if Thrym knows where Mjölnir is. Thrym laughs and admits freely. He has stolen it and hidden it 8 miles beneath the earth, and he will not return it unless the gods bring him Freyja as his bride. Loki returns to Asgard and reports this to Thor. Together, they go to Freyja and tell her she must prepare to go to Jotunheim as Thrym's bride. Freyja's response is immediate and volcanic. She is so furious that her breathing causes her necklace, BR facing Gaemon, to burst apart. She refuses. Absolutely. She is the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, war, and death. She is no one's bargaining chip. The gods convene an assembly to discuss what to do. Heimdall, the watchman of the gods, suggests a plan. Thor himself will disguise himself as Freyja, dress in bridal clothing, wear the necklace Br Facingamenn, and go to Jotunheimr in her place. Thor is appalled. This is humiliating. He will be mocked, but Loki points out the obvious. Without Mjölnir, the giants will overrun Asgard. There is no choice. Thor agrees. They dress Thor in a bridal gown, a linen headdress, and a veil. They fasten Br Facingamenn around his neck. They hang keys from his belt, as was customary for a bride. Loki disguises himself as a bridesmaid. Together, they ride Thor's goat, drawn chariot to Jotunheimr, the sound of its wheels like thunder across the mountains. Thrym is overjoyed. He orders a wedding feast prepared. Oxen are slaughtered, salmon and mead are brought forth, and all the giants of his hall gather to witness the marriage. Thor, veiled and silent, is seated at the high table beside Thrym. The feast begins. Thor, despite the absurdity of his disguise, is still Thor. He eats an entire ox. He devours 8 salmon. He drinks 3 casks of mead. The giants stare in astonishment. Thrym leans over to Loki and whispers, "I have never seen a bride with such an appetite." Loki, quick-witted, replies, "Freyja has not eaten for 8 days, so eager was she to come to Jotunheimr." Thrym, satisfied, leans forward to lift the veil and kiss his bride. But when he glimpses Thor's eyes beneath the veil, blazing with barely restrained fury, he recoils in terror. "Why are Freyja's eyes so fierce?" he asks. "They burn like fire." Loki answers smoothly, "Freyja has not slept for 8 nights, so eager was she for this wedding." Thrym, reassured, calls for the hammer. "Bring Mjölnir," he commands. "Let it be laid in the bride's lap, as is the custom, to sanctify the marriage." The giants bring the hammer forth and place it in Thor's lap. The moment Thor's hand closes around the handle, the charade is over. He throws off the veil, rises to his full height, and begins the slaughter. Mjölnir rises and falls. Thrym dies first, skull crushed, then his brothers, his kinsmen, his servants, every giant in the hall. Thor kills them all. The wedding feast becomes a massacre. The walls run red. The tables are overturned. The mead spills across the floor, mixed with blood. When the killing is done, Thor and Loki return to Asgard. The hammer restored, order re-established. This myth is often read as comic, and it is, in part. The image of Thor in a wedding dress, eating absurd quantities of food, is inherently humorous. But the humor does not diminish the underlying seriousness. The myth is about the absolute necessity of Mjölnir to the cosmic order. Without it, the gods are vulnerable, and Thor is willing to endure humiliation, to sacrifice his pride, to do what must be done to recover the weapon that keeps the giants at bay. It also reveals the cunning required of even the strongest god. Thor is not the cleverest of the Facer. That distinction belongs to Odin, or to Loki when his cunning is directed toward helping rather than harming. But Thor is not stupid. He understands the stakes. He endures the indignity because the alternative is the destruction of everything he has sworn to protect. There is also a deeper theme here about boundaries and transgression. The giants, for all their chaos, are not merely evil. They exist. They have their own realm. But when they reach across the boundary into Asgard, when they steal what belongs to the gods, when they demand what is not theirs to take, they must be met with overwhelming force. Thor is the guardian of that boundary. He is the wall between order and chaos. Another myth that reveals Thor's nature and his limitations. Of his fishing trip with the giant Hymir, preserved in the poem Hymiskvi, Freya in the Poetic Edda, and retold in Snorri's Prose Edda. The gods need a cauldron large enough to brew ale for a feast. Tifair, the one-handed god of law and war, tells Thor that his father, the giant Hymir, owns such a cauldron. Thor and Tifair journey to Hymir's hall. The giant is wary, but agrees to let Thor accompany him on a fishing expedition the next morning. Thor asks Hymir for bait. Hymir, annoyed, tells him to get his own. Thor goes to Hymir's herd of cattle and rips the head off the largest ox, an animal called Himinhage Fetor. sky, bellower. He brings the head to the shore. They row out into the ocean. Hymir catches 2 whales on his line. Thor baits his hook with the ox head and casts it into the depths. What takes the bait is no ordinary fish. It is Jafamungandra, the Midgard serpent, the monstrous offspring of Loki, so vast that it encircles the entire world, biting its own tail. The serpent seizes the bait, and the hook pierces the roof of its mouth. It thrashes in agony. Thor, gripping the line, is pulled toward the side of the boat. He braces himself, pushing his feet through the bottom of the boat and against the ocean floor. He pulls. The serpent pulls back. The ocean boils. The line soars through Thor's palms. He pulls harder. The serpent's head rises above the waves. Thor and Jafamungandra lock eyes. This is the creature prophesied to kill him at Ragnarök, and he is the god prophesied to kill it. Fate stares at fate. Thor raises Mjölnir to strike the killing blow. And at that moment, Hymir, terrified, seeing the wrath of the serpent and fearing the boat will capsize, or perhaps understanding that this encounter is fated for another day, draws his knife and cuts the line. The serpent sinks back into the depths, the hook still lodged in its jaw, and vanishes beneath the black water. Thor, enraged, strikes Hymir with his fist and knocks the giant overboard. The 2 return to shore in tense silence. They wrestle for possession of the cauldron, and Thor wins. But the encounter with the serpent is unresolved. The fated battle is postponed, not prevented. This myth operates on several levels. It is a story of hubris and restraint, though whose hubris and whose restraint is ambiguous. Is Thor overreaching by attempting to kill the serpent before the appointed time? Or is Hymir interfering with fate? The sagas do not moralize. They present the event and let it stand. What the myth reveals is Thor's essential character: courage that borders on recklessness, strength that almost succeeds in defying fate, and a willingness to confront the most terrible forces of chaos, alone if necessary. But it also shows that even Thor cannot simply force the cosmos to bend to his will. The serpent will sink back into the sea. The final battle will come when it is meant to come, and not before. The most philosophically complex of Thor's myths is the journey to Fatgarfeia, Loki's castle, preserved in Snorri Sturluson. This tale is not primarily about physical combat. It is about perception, illusion, and the limits of even divine power when confronted with forces that operate on a scale beyond comprehension. Thor sets out with Loki and 2 human servants, Fjords and Allfather, to travel to Fatgarfeia, the outer realm, a place somewhere beyond the normal boundaries of Jotunheim. Along the way, they take shelter in what appears to be a large hall, only to discover in the morning that it is actually the thumb of a mitten belonging to a giant named Skrimir. Big fellow. So enormous that they mistook part of his glove for a building. Skrimir travels with them for a time, carrying their provisions in his pack. But when they try to open it at night to eat, they cannot undo the knots. Frustrated, Thor strikes Skrimir in the head with Mjölnir 3 times over the course of the night. Each time, Skrimir wakes slightly, wondering if a leaf or an acorn fell on him, then goes back to sleep. Thor's mightiest blows are as nothing to this giant disturbed. They continue. They arrive at Fatgarfeia, a fortress so tall they must bend their necks back to see the top. Inside, they meet Fatgarfeia, Loki, the king of the outer realm, a giant of immense cunning. He greets them with barely disguised contempt and says that no one is allowed to stay in his hall unless they can demonstrate some exceptional skill. Loki boasts that he can eat faster than anyone. Fatgarfeia. Loki summons a giant named Loki and sets before them a long trough filled with meat. Loki eats as fast as he can, consuming meat after meat. But Loki eats not only the meat but also the bones and the trough itself, and finishes first. Loki has lost. Jafalfi, the human servant, boasts that he can run faster than anyone. Fatgarfeia, Loki summons a boy named Hugi to race against him. Fjords is swift, but Hugi outraces him so completely that he reaches the finish line and turns back to meet Fjords at the midpoint. Fjords has lost. Now it is Thor's turn. No fire, he drinks long and deep, expecting to drain it. But when he lowers the horn, the level has barely changed. He drinks again, harder. The level drops a little more, but not much. He drinks a third time, straining with all his might. But still, the horn is far from empty. Thor is humiliated. Karfeir, Loki says. Well, perhaps you are not as strong as we thought. Can you perform some other feat? Some of my men amuse themselves by lifting my cat off the ground. It is just a cat. Perhaps you could try. An enormous grey cat pads into the hall. Thor, determined, grips the cat's belly and tries to lift. He strains. The cat's paws remain on the floor. He pulls harder. One paw lifts. He heaves with all his divine might. And finally, one paw comes off the ground before the cat squirms free. Thor cannot lift the cat. Now fate Garfeir. Loki is openly mocking. Perhaps, he says, you might wrestle since you are weak at other things. Perhaps you could wrestle an old woman. Here is my foster mother, Ellie. She has thrown men who seemed stronger than you. An old bent woman enters. Thor, humiliated and enraged, grapples with her. But no matter how he tries, he cannot move her. In fact, the more he wrestles, the more his own footing slips. Finally, he falls to one knee. Fate Garfeir Loki stops the match. Enough, he says. You have proven you are not as mighty as your reputation. You should leave. Thor and his companions are given food and lodging for the night. And in the morning, Fate Garfeir, Loki himself escorts them to the gates of the fortress. Once they are outside, he stops. Now I will tell you the truth, he says. And if I had known how strong you truly were, I would never have let you into my hall because you have endangered us all. He explains the illusions. Skrymir was himself in disguise, and he had used magic to place a mountain between Thor's blows and his own head. When Thor struck, he was actually striking the mountain, and the hammer blows carved 3 deep valleys into the stone. Loki, who outwitted Loki in the eating contest, was wildfire itself, which consumes everything. Hugi, who outran Faj Failfi, was thought. No man can outrun thought. The drinking horn was connected to the sea, and though Thor could not empty it, the cat was not a cat, but Mungandra in disguise. And Thor nearly tore the world serpent from its place in the ocean. A feat so terrifying that all the giants in the hall were struck with dread. And Ellie, the old woman, was old age itself, which no one, not even gods, can overcome. You are far stronger than we imagined, Fate Garfeir, Loki says. And if you try to return to Fate Garfeir, we will defend ourselves with every illusion and enchantment we possess. You will never find this place again. Thor, enraged, raises Mjölnir to strike him down, but Fate Garfeir, Loki vanishes, and with him the fortress, leaving Thor and his companions standing in an empty plain. This is perhaps the most intellectually rich of Thor's myths. It is a meditation on the difference between strength and power, between what can be changed and what is simply the nature of reality. Thor is stronger than any being in the cosmos, but there are forces he cannot fight. The sea, thought, time, death. These are not enemies to be slain. They are woven into the structure of existence. And yet, even in failing, Thor demonstrated power beyond comprehension. He lifted the world serpent. He wrestled old age to one knee. The giants feared him precisely because he came so close to shattering the fundamental limits of the cosmos. Thor was not a distant deity whose worship required elaborate priesthoods or mystery initiations. He was present in the daily life of the Norse world, invoked at the boundary stone, the ship's prow, the marriage bed, and the threshold of the home. His worship was both communal and personal, formalized and improvised, deeply woven into the rhythms of an agricultural and seafaring society, living in one of the harshest climates in Europe. The Norse did not have a centralized religious authority or a sacred text. Theology was embedded in practice, in story, in custom. Worship was conducted at outdoor sites, at temples, and in the home. The gods were real presences to be honored, negotiated with, and when necessary, reminded of their obligations. This was a transactional cosmology. Offerings were made not purely out of devotion, but because the gods and humans existed in a reciprocal relationship. The gods needed the belief and honor of humans, and humans needed the protection and blessing of the gods. The primary form of communal worship was the Fate, a sacrificial feast. The word Fate is cognate with the Old English Betan, to sacrifice, and the practice was central to Norse religious life. Fates were held at key points in the agricultural and seasonal calendar. At the beginning of winter, Vetran Feitar, winter nights. At midwinter, Jafeil, which became Yule after Christianization. And at the beginning of summer, there were also special Fates to ensure victory in battle, to bless a marriage or a new hall, or to avert disaster. The structure of a Fate involved several elements. First, an animal was sacrificed, most commonly a horse, boar, bull, or goat, though the size and type of animal varied depending on the wealth of the community and the importance of the occasion. The animal was ritually slaughtered, and its blood, called hautwas, was collected in a bowl called a hautbolli. A bundle of twigs or branches called a hautain was used to sprinkle the blood on the altar, on the walls of the temple or the sacred enclosure, and on the participants themselves. This was an act of consecration, marking the space, the people, and the ritual as sacred. After the blood rite, the meat of the animal was cooked and shared in a communal feast. This was not a solemn, silent meal, but a loud, joyous gathering with drinking, toasting, and storytelling. The god or gods to whom the Fete was dedicated were invoked, and the participants drank to their honor. Specific toasts, called full or bragaful, were made to Odin for victory, to Fefe and Freya for a good harvest, to Freyja for love and fertility, and above all, to Thor for protection, for the safety of the community, and for the defeat of enemies. Thor's Fates were particularly important for farmers and sailors. In the Icelandic sagas, there are accounts of individuals swearing oaths on Thor's hammer, on rings dedicated to Thor, or in Thor's name. The Land Feimab Feike, the Book of Settlements, a medieval Icelandic text chronicling the settlement of Iceland in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, contains numerous references to settlers who dedicated their new lands to Thor, who named geographic features after him, and who invoked his protection against the hostile forces of nature and rival claimants. Zone such settler, Thorolf Mostraskeg, Thorolf Most, Baird, is described in the Arbigja saga as a devoted worshipper of Thor. When he fled Norway to settle in Iceland, he threw the high seat pillars of his hall, carved with the image of Thor, overboard as he approached the coast, vowing to settle wherever they washed ashore. The pillars came to rest at a place he named Thorsnes, Thor's Point. He built a temple there and declared the headland sacred to Thor, forbidding bloodshed or the relief of bodily needs on that ground. So strict were his purity requirements. The saga describes the temple in some detail, though how much is accurate description and how much is literary elaboration is debated. It was, the saga says, a large building with a door in the side wall. Inside, at the far end, was an inner sanctum called the Hofgofani, where a ring rested on an altar. This ring was used for oaths, and it was sacred to Thor. The temple also contained images of the gods, whether carved in wood or stone, the text does not specify, and the altar was stained with blood from sacrifices. This description aligns with other fragmentary references to Norse temples in the sagas, and in the writings of Christian outsiders. Adam of Bremen, a German historian writing in the late 11th century, described the temple at Uppsala, Sweden, one of the most important religious centers in pre-Christian Scandinavia. According to Adam, the temple was covered in gold and contained statues of Thor, Odin, and Freya. Thor's statue sat in the center as the most important of the three. Every 9 years, a great festival was held, and 9 males of every creature were sacrificed, including, according to Adam, human beings. The bodies were hung in the sacred grove beside the temple. Adam's account has been disputed. He was a Christian outsider writing from hearsay, and he may have exaggerated or misunderstood what he heard. But archaeological excavations at Gamla Uppsala, Old Uppsala, have confirmed the existence of a significant religious and political center, and the presence of large burial mounds and evidence of ritual activity lends some support to his claims. Thor's particular associations made him especially relevant to daily life. He was invoked for weather, not just to stop storms, but also to bring rain when it was needed. For Thor controlled both the destructive and the life-giving aspects of storms. He was invoked for strength and health, particularly for men. Amulets of Mjölnir have been found in male graves far more often than in female graves, though not exclusively. He was invoked at weddings, and the laying of a hammer or a representation of a hammer in the bride's lap was a ritual act of blessing and fertility. In the Arbigja saga, when a man named Thorstein dies, his body is prepared with weapons, and Thor is asked to receive him. There is some ambiguity in the sources as to where the dead go. Some warriors are chosen by the Valkyries to go to Odin's hall, Valhalla, but most people seem to have gone to Hel, the realm of the dead, which is not a place of punishment, but simply the continuation of existence in a shadowy, quieter form. Thor, as protector, may have been invoked to ensure safe passage, or simply to honor the deceased's devotion in life. The ubiquity of Mjölnir pendants is perhaps the best evidence of Thor's centrality in Norse popular religion. These amulets have been found across the Viking world, from Scandinavia to Iceland, Greenland, the British Isles, and the Slavic territories. They were worn by men, women, and children. Some were simple and functional. Others were works of art, elaborately decorated with interlace patterns, animal motifs, and runic inscriptions. The fact that they were made in such quantities, and from materials ranging from iron to silver to gold, suggests that Thor's protection was sought by people at every level of society, from thralls to kings. One particularly striking example is the Mjölnir pendant found in a grave at Fej in Sweden, dating to the 10th century. It is made of silver and inscribed with runes that read, "May Thor hallow." This formula appears on several Mjölnir amulets, indicating a specific ritual invocation, a prayer in miniature worn against the skin. In the late Viking Age, as Christianity began to penetrate Scandinavia, there was a period of religious syncretism and competition. The Icelandic sagas record this transition in vivid detail. In the year 1000 CE, Iceland formally adopted Christianity as its official religion, though private pagan worship was still permitted. But for decades before and after this official conversion, there was tension, negotiation, and hybridity. One saga tells of a man who wore both a Mjölnir pendant and a Christian cross around his neck, invoking both Thor and Christ depending on the circumstances. When challenged by a Christian missionary, he responded, "I keep Thor for dangerous situations at sea and in battle, but I call on Christ in matters of the soul." This was not seen as hypocritical by either side, but as pragmatic, a recognition that different powers governed different aspects of existence. There are also accounts of confrontations between worshippers of Thor and Christian missionaries. One famous anecdote recorded in several sagas tells of a missionary who smashed an image of Thor in a temple. The worshippers waited for Thor to strike the missionary down. When nothing happened, some were converted, but others insisted that Thor had chosen not to respond, that he disdained to punish a fool, or that the Christian god had used trickery. The theological argument was not resolved by a single act. Conversion was ultimately accomplished, not primarily through theological debate, but through political and social pressure. Christian kings in Norway and Denmark made baptism a condition for trade, alliance, and political legitimacy. Christian missionaries established churches, often built on the sites of old temples. Gradually, over the course of a century, the old gods were officially abandoned, but their presence lingered. The transition from Norse paganism to Christianity was not a sudden rupture, but a long, uneven process of suppression, adaptation, and transformation. The gods did not vanish overnight. They were reinterpreted, demonized, folded into folklore, and quietly mourned by those who remembered the old ways. And then, centuries later, they were rediscovered. First by scholars, then by poets and nationalists, and finally by a global popular culture hungry for myth. The most important figure in the preservation of Norse mythology is Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic poet, historian, and politician who lived from 1179 to 1241 CE. By his time, Iceland had been Christian for more than 200 years. But the old stories were still told, and the old poetic forms, especially skaldic verse, with its complex metaphors and allusions to myth, were still practiced. Snorri understood that these traditions were in danger of being lost. Christian Icelanders might speak Old Norse and preserve heroic legends, but the specific religious meaning of the myths, the theology, the cosmology, the ritual context, was fading. Snorri composed the Prose Edda as a handbook for poets, but it became much more, a systematic exposition of Norse mythology. In its first part, Gylfaginning, the tricking of Gylfi, Snorri recounts the creation of the world, the structure of the cosmos, the deeds of the gods, and the events of Ragnarök. He presents these myths within a framing narrative. A Swedish king named Gylfi travels to Asgard in disguise and asks the gods to explain the nature of existence. Three mysterious figures, High, Just, As, High, and Third, answer his questions, recounting the myths. This framing device allows Snorri to present pagan mythology while maintaining a Christian stance. He is recording what the pagans believed, not endorsing it as truth. But the care and detail with which he recounts the myths suggest a deep respect for the material, and possibly a nostalgia for a lost world. Snorri's account of Thor is both reverent and slightly ironic. He emphasizes Thor's strength, his loyalty, his protection of gods and humans. But he also notes Thor's occasional lack of subtlety, his temper, and his willingness to resort to violence when more diplomatic solutions might suffice. Snorri, writing in a Christian, quasi-feudal society, may have found Thor's bluntness somewhat archaic, even as he recognized the god's enduring appeal. The other major source for Norse mythology is the Poetic Edda, a collection of Old Norse poems preserved in the Codex Regius, a manuscript dating to around 1270 CE, but containing poems that are likely much older, some possibly dating back to the 9th or 10th century. Unlike the Prose Edda, which is continuous narrative prose, the Poetic Edda is a collection of mythological and heroic lays, composed in various meters and voices. Several of the Eddic poems focus on Thor. Farimskvi, Freya, the tale of the theft of Mjölnir, is one of the most complete and entertaining. Hemiskvia recounts the fishing expedition and the encounter with Jfe Mungandra. H. Feabar Faisal J. Fey is a flighting, a ritual insult contest between Thor and a mysterious ferryman who refuses to take him across a river. The ferryman is eventually revealed to be Odin in disguise, and the poem becomes a debate about the relative merits of wisdom versus strength, kings versus common folk, strategy versus direct action. These poems were not composed as scripture, but as entertainment, education, and cultural memory. They were performed at feasts, recited by traveling poets, and taught to the young as a way of understanding the world and their place in it. The fact that they survived the Christianization of Iceland, preserved by scribes who were themselves Christian monks and scholars, is remarkable. It suggests that even in a Christian society, there was a recognition that these stories were part of the cultural inheritance, too valuable to be lost. Beyond Iceland, however, the suppression of Norse paganism was more thorough. In Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, where centralized Christian monarchies exerted stronger control, the old religion was actively repressed. Temples were torn down, sacred groves were burned, and priests of the old gods were exiled or killed. BL feats were forbidden. The legal codes of Christian Scandinavia imposed severe penalties for pagan worship, fines, confiscation of property, outlawry, even execution. Yet the transition was never total. In rural areas, practices that looked suspiciously like BL fate continued under the guise of Christian festivals. The calendar of Christian saints' days conveniently overlapped with the old seasonal celebrations. Yule, the midwinter feast, became Christmas. The spring fertility festivals became Easter, and certain folk practices, leaving offerings at natural sites, invoking protection from spirits of place, wearing amulets, continued for centuries, reinterpreted as folk magic rather than religion. Thor himself was recast in folklore. In some regions, he was remembered as a saint. Saint Olaf, the Christian king of Norway who forcibly converted the country, absorbed some of Thor's characteristics in popular memory, including his role as a giant killer and protector. In other regions, Thor became a figure of fairy tales and local legends, a once powerful being who had been banished by the arrival of Christ. The Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, writing around 1200 CE, presented the Norse gods in his Gesta Danorum, deeds of the Danes as historical kings and heroes who had been worshipped as gods by a credulous people. This euhemeristic interpretation, the idea that gods were originally human beings deified by later generations, was common in medieval Christian scholarship and allowed writers to acknowledge the myths without endorsing them as truth. For several centuries, Thor existed only in this marginalized, half-remembered form. In old manuscripts studied by antiquarians, in folk tales told by grandmothers, and in place, names carved into the landscape. Thorshavn, the capital of the Faroe Islands. Torsfana in Sweden. Thurso in Scotland. Thursday itself, named after Thor in English, German Donnerstag, Thunder's Day, and Dutch Donderdag. Then, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the gods began to return. The Romantic movement in Europe brought with it a fascination with the past, with folk culture, and with national identity. Scholars began to study medieval manuscripts with new seriousness. The poetic Edda was translated into modern languages. Artists and poets began to draw on Norse mythology as a source of inspiration, particularly in Germany and Scandinavia, where it was seen as a native alternative to the Greco-Roman classical tradition. In 1851, the painting is romantic in style, dramatic, heroic, nationalistic, and it helped to establish a visual iconography for Thor that emphasized his physical might and his role as protector of civilization. Richard Wagner's operatic Cycle der Ring, Des Nibelungen, 1876, drew on Norse and Germanic mythology, though it focused more on Odin Wotan, Loki, and the Valkyries than on Thor. Wagner's appropriation of the myths was deeply problematic. His work became entangled with German nationalism, and later with Nazi ideology, which attempted to claim Norse mythology as the exclusive heritage of the Aryan race. This appropriation did immense damage, associating the myths with fascism and racial supremacy in ways that persist today. After World War II, there was a deliberate distancing from Norse mythology in much of Europe, particularly in Germany because of its association with Nazism. But in Scandinavia, and especially in Iceland, where the myths had been preserved most completely, and where there was less political baggage, a quieter revival continued. In the 1970s, a modern pagan movement called Faysatrophy, belief in the Facer, began to emerge, first in Iceland and then in Scandinavia, the United States, and elsewhere. Faysatray is a reconstructionist religion, attempting to revive pre-Christian Norse paganism based on the sagas, the Eddas, and archaeological evidence. Practitioners hold BL fates, honor the gods, and celebrate the old festivals. Thor, as the most accessible and widely worshipped of the Norse gods, is central to Faysatrophy practice. There are significant debates within modern Faysatrophy about what it means to worship the old gods in a contemporary context. Some groups are universalist, welcoming anyone regardless of ethnicity. Others are folkish, arguing that Norse paganism is the ancestral religion of people of Northern European descent and should be practiced primarily by them. This has led to tensions, and some folkish groups have been associated with white supremacist ideologies, an association that most Faysatrophy practitioners strongly reject. The scholarly study of Norse mythology also advanced significantly in the 20th century. Linguists, archaeologists, and religious historians produced careful, nuanced analyses of the texts, the artifacts, and the historical context. The work of scholars like E.O.G. Turville, Petter, Hilda Ellis Davidson, and Rudolf Simek helped to establish Norse mythology as a serious field of academic study, distinct from both nationalist appropriation and popular fantasy. But it was in popular culture that Thor truly returned to prominence, and in a form that would have been unrecognizable to his Viking worshippers. In August 1962, in the pages of Journey into Mystery, Number 83, published by Marvel Comics. A new superhero appeared. He was Thor, but not the Thor of the Eddas. He was a fusion of Norse myth and American superhero convention, created by writer Stan Lee, scripter Larry Lieber, and artist Jack Kirby. In the Marvel version, Thor was the son of Odin and had been banished to Earth in the mortal form of a disabled medical student named Donald Blake. When Blake struck a walking stick on a stone, he transformed into Thor, gaining divine power and the hammer Mjölnir. This version of Thor was simplified, sanitized, and moralized in ways that the original myths never were. The Marvel Thor was unambiguously heroic. He protected humanity not because they were under his stewardship as part of the cosmic order, but because he had a personal moral commitment to justice and righteousness. He spoke in faux archaic English. "Verily, thou shalt not." That had nothing to do with Old Norse, but evoked a sense of antiquity for American readers. His rogues gallery included Loki, reimagined as a purely villainous trickster, and various other figures from Norse myth, all recontextualized as supervillains. Mjölnir in the Marvel version was inscribed with an enchantment placed by Odin. "Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor." This worthiness concept has no basis in the original myths. Mjölnir returned to Thor's hand because it was magically bound to do so, not because Thor was virtuous, but it became central to the Marvel version, creating dramatic tension around the question of who could wield the hammer, and introducing a moral dimension that the Viking Thor never had. Marvel's Thor became a major character, appearing in the Avengers alongside Iron Man, Captain America, and Hulk. Over the decades, the comics explored various storylines, some drawing more deeply on Norse mythology, others moving into pure superhero fantasy. The character underwent changes in creative direction, costume design, and personality, but the core remained. He was a hero, a protector, and the wielder of the hammer. In 2011, the Marvel Cinematic Universe brought Thor to film, portrayed by Australian actor Chris Hemsworth. The film, directed by Kenneth Branagh, attempted to balance Shakespeare, influenced royal drama with superhero spectacle. It depicted Asgard as a gleaming realm of science and magic, Odin as a stern but loving father, Loki as a jealous, misunderstood villain, and Thor as an arrogant warrior who learns humility. The film was a commercial success, and Thor became one of the central figures of the MCU, appearing in multiple sequels and crossover films. The MCU's Thor is even further removed from the original myths than the comic book version. He is charming, occasionally comedic, and gradually transitions from a warrior to a more philosophical, emotionally vulnerable figure, especially in Thor: Ragnarök 2017, which reinterpreted Norse eschatology as a psychedelic space opera, and Avengers: Endgame 2019, which depicted Thor struggling with depression and trauma. For millions of people worldwide, this is the Thor they know. A blonde superhero with a cape, a magic hammer, and a place on the Avengers, the original myths, and in many ways more compelling than the Marvel narratives. This is not inherently a problem. Mythological figures have always been adapted and reimagined. The Greek gods of Roman literature were different from the gods of Homeric epic, and both were different from the gods worshipped in actual ritual practice. What matters is whether the adaptation retains something essential, some core truth, or whether it simply uses the name and the iconography as a brand. Marvel's Thor retains, at minimum, the idea of a god who protects humanity from forces of chaos. He retains the hammer as an instrument of power. He retains the sense that he is not merely strong but necessary, that without him, something terrible would happen. But he loses the moral ambiguity, the strangeness, the cosmological depth. He loses the sense that the gods themselves are fated, that even divine power has limits, that the universe is not a story of good versus evil, but of order versus entropy, and that entropy will eventually win. Other modern adaptations of Thor have appeared in video games, fantasy literature, and television. In the video game series, God of War 2018, Thor appears as an antagonist, brutal, violent, and deeply flawed, more in line with the saga's depiction of a god who kills without hesitation. but is not purely evil. In Neil Gaiman's novel American Gods 2001, Thor is mentioned as one of the old gods who came to America with Scandinavian immigrants, but faded as belief in him waned, a poignant meditation on what happens to gods when they are forgotten. The question is not whether these modern versions are accurate. Mythology has never been static. The question is whether they preserve the dignity and complexity of the original, or whether they reduce it to mere spectacle. To understand why Thor endures, we must return to what he represents at the deepest level. He is not simply a god of thunder, in the way that Zeus is god of lightning, or Indra is god of storms. His role is not to create or to rule, but to stand at the boundary between the world of order, Asgard, Midgard, the realms where gods and humans live under law and structure, and the world of chaos, Jotunheimr, the realm of the giants, where primal forces churn without purpose or morality. In the Norse worldview, chaos is not evil. The giants are not demons. They simply are. And they were here first, before the gods, before humans, before the structure of the cosmos. But structure, civilization, life itself, requires boundaries. It requires that chaos be held at bay, not forever. Nothing lasts forever, but long enough for meaning to exist, for children to be born, for harvests to be gathered, for stories to be told. Thor, with Mjölnir, enforces that boundary. Every giant he kills is a temporary victory. The giants will return. They always return. At Ragnarök, they will break free in overwhelming numbers, and even Thor will fall. But until that day, he fights. Not because he believes he will ultimately win, but because fighting is what he does. It is his nature, his purpose, his duty. This is why the common people loved him more than they loved Odin. Odin was the god of kings and poets, the god who sought knowledge and manipulated fate. Odin was distant, ambiguous, terrifying. But Thor was comprehensible. Thor was loyal. Thor did not demand sacrifice of the self or submission to inscrutable plans. He demanded only that you be brave, that you honor your word, and that you stand against the chaos that would destroy you. In the modern world, we no longer believe that thunder is caused by a god riding across the sky in a chariot pulled by goats. We understand meteorology. We understand that the universe operates according to physical laws, not divine will. But we have not escaped the existential condition that made Thor necessary. We still live on the boundary between order and chaos. We still face forces larger than ourselves. Climate catastrophe, pandemics, war, economic collapse, the slow entropy of our own bodies. We still need the idea of a protector, someone who stands between us and the void. Thor endures because the need for Thor endures, not as a literal belief, but as a story we tell ourselves about strength, protection, and the defiance of inevitable doom. The hammer of the gods still rings out, somewhere in the back of our collective imagination, and the giants still fear it, because they know that as long as the hammer is raised, the fight is not over. Thursday still carries his name. The echo of the thunder still rolls through the mountains, and when the final battle comes, when our own Ragnarök arrives, whatever form it takes, we will want to believe that someone, somewhere, is still willing to fight. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more folklore, myths, and mysterious creatures. See you next